Okay, good, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight, both those of you in person and online. We appreciate your participation in this. My name is Kate Buckman. I'm the River Steward for New Hampshire at the Connecticut River Conservancy. And tonight we're going to be going over the 401 water quality certification process in New Hampshire for the relicensings of the Wilder, Bellows Falls and Vernon dams with a focus on the Bellows Falls Dam. So as many of you may have known, we are hopefully nearing the end of the relicensings of these hydro facilities. This process started in 2012, and it's not only the 3 facilities that I mentioned that are in New Hampshire and Vermont, but also inclusive of 2 facilities in Massachusetts, the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility, and then the Turner's Falls Dam as well. All 5 of these facilities are moving through the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing process together, and they all have to go through this 401 water quality certification in their respective states. So the relicensing itself is governed by the Federal Power Act, and the license will be issued by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There are a number of different laws that come into play underneath this, and one of them is the Clean Water Act, which governs the 401 certification process. 401 literally refers to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And this section states that those who are applying for federal permits also need to apply with state level water quality standards. So what does this process look like? So under Section 401, as you can see here, it states that any applicant for a federal license or permit to conduct any activity which may result in a discharge into the navigable waters shall provide licensing or permitting agency a certification from the state in which the discharge originates. So what triggers this 401 water quality certification process is 1, the federal license or permit, and this is the hydropower operating license that they have applied for to FERC, a federal agency, and a discharge into state waters. With hydropower facilities, this discharge is counted as either water coming through the turbines and going out through the tail race, or water that is spilling over the dam. So because these 3 hydro facilities are discharging into the state waters of New Hampshire, that has triggered this 401 process. And so this discharge needs to be from a point source, and that point source, as I said, is the tail race or the dam in this case. But it has broad impacts in this process. So it considers anything that is under the state water quality statutes, which we'll go through a little bit more detail shortly. And all project operations must comply with all the water quality standards of the state. So it's not just the water that's coming through the tail race, it's actually all of the project operations that are considered in this. So this process got started in April of this year by Great River Hydro, who owns three facilities, applying for a 401 certification in the state of New Hampshire and also in the state of Vermont. New Hampshire DES certified that they received a complete application, and now we're in this stage of the process. Tonight, I'm giving an informational session so that you can understand more about this process and how to participate in it. But ultimately, New Hampshire DES will also issue a draft certification, which the public can comment on. And DES will then have to take all those comments into account. And the final step is they can either grant a 401 water quality certification, which just granting it means they're not changing anything from the way the applicant applied. So in this case, Great River Hydro, they can grant with conditions, which is often what happens. And so they take that application, they grant a certification, but they say, you must do these things while you are operating this facility in order to comply with water quality standards in the state. The state can also waive their certification by notice or by inaction. So by federal law, they have a year to complete this process. If the state does not complete the process within that time that has been agreed upon through FERC, they are waiving their ability to issue a water quality certification by inaction. They can also waive the certification by putting out a notice that they're not going to act upon it. And then the fourth thing that can happen at the end of this process is the state can full on deny the water quality certification. So they can say, no, what you are applying for will not comply with the state's water quality standards, and we will not certify it under our standards. So what does this water quality certification do? It's actually a pretty powerful tool that allows states to maintain control over their water quality under their jurisdiction. So it allows both states and tribes to deny or put conditions on any federal license or permit that may impact water quality in their state. It does require a public process, so it allows the people who live in that state and utilize that water to participate in the process as well. And it recognizes the state's expertise in their own jurisdiction. So the 401 water quality certification, when issued by the state with conditions, cannot be changed by FERC. So the federal agency issuing the final license or permit can't second guess state 401 decisions. It covers both direct and indirect impacts of the operation of the facility. And it does maintain or help to maintain state control over water quality. And in some cases, state water quality standards may be more protective than federal ones. And so this is an area where maintaining state control can be very important. So it's a pretty powerful tool in this process, and one that we encourage everyone to participate in the public process so the state also knows what is important to all of us. The river is a public trust resource. It belongs to all of us. We have a say in the water quality as well. What a water quality certification does not do is it does not require mitigation for non-water quality issues. So you must be able to directly link an issue to a water quality standard in order for it to be covered under the 401 certification process. And it does not address discharges outside of the state, except under a particular circumstance where the EPA administrator has the discretion to come to the state and say, hey, we're certifying this process in another state, but this discharge does come downstream and have impact on your state. Do you have any comments about this process? So the water quality standards within the state are really important because they are what is setting the basis for how we can put conditions on the operating license. They're the benchmarks for water quality, and they ensure the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the state's waters. And they are composed of basically three parts, right? So designated uses, how we are using or want to use that water. Criteria, which we'll talk about a bit more, and these are what people often think of when they think of water quality standards. And then an anti-degradation policy, which ensures that when new permits are issued, we are not backsliding on any water quality gains that we have made. So designated uses are just what they sound like. They're how we want to use the water. And so they can be things like primary contact recreation, which is swimming. So your skin is coming in contact with the water. Secondary contact recreation, things like boating. Fish consumption. So surface waters need to be able to support fish that are safe to eat. So not a lot of pollutants or contaminants in those tissues. In tidal waters, particularly shellfish consumption also is important. And then aquatic life integrity just means that we can support a biological community that is comparable to what would be there if this discharge was not happening or this operation was not happening. And so we want to have a diverse biological community that supports all of the ecological functions that we want there to be in the river. These is aquatic life integrity. We're also talking about wildlife. So anyone who knows a little bit about ecology and the environment knows that the river doesn't just support the organisms that live in it, it supports a whole community of organisms outside of it too. And so surface waters need to provide habitat that is supportive of wildlife as well. And then our rivers and lakes and ponds in New Hampshire often function as drinking water supplies as well. And so the drinking water designated use is an important one too. So these designated uses are given to sections of water by the state, and they're classified, and there may be different designated uses under each classification. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But designated uses of a water body need to be protected, even if they are not currently being attained, right? And so you might have a situation where a river has been given a designated use of primary contact recreation. So we want it to be swimmable. But right at the moment, due to particular circumstances, it's not safe to swim in that river. Primary contact recreation or swimming is still a designated use. And thus we need to be working towards attaining that designated use. And that's something that the New Hampshire DES and the other agencies are looking at, whether we're attaining the designated uses, and if not, why, and how do we get there? And if the reason why we are not attaining them is due to something like a hydropower facility, that comes into play when they are conditioning the 401 water quality certification. So in New Hampshire, we have two classes of water quality, Class A and Class B. Class A is the highest. We do not allow any discharge of sewage or waste into waters that are classified as Class A. And they are acceptable for water supply after adequate treatment. Most of the waters in the state are Class B waters, and this is the second highest tier of water quality. And under state statute, Class B waters have no objectionable physical characteristics, which is pretty subjective. It's pretty broad. And we do not allow disposal of sewage or waste into Class B waters without adequate treatment. Class B waters must be acceptable for fishing, swimming, and other recreational purposes. So here we have some designated uses in Class B waters. And they must be acceptable for a water supply after adequate treatment. And so the Connecticut River in the region that are affected by the Bellas Falls Dam, as well as the Vernon and Wilder dams, are classified as Class B waters in New Hampshire. So how do we know whether we are attaining those uses that have been designated to the different water bodies? And this is where the criteria comes into play. So these are conditions that must be met to support the designated use. If these conditions are not met, the water body is considered impaired. And so every other year, the state has to put out what is called the 305B list. 305B again refers to a specific section of the Clean Water Act. And this list is basically a survey of the water quality within the state. If the water in a particular area is impaired or threatened because of a pollutant and is in need of what's called a TMDL, or a total maximum daily load, that is then put on a second list called the 303D list, which indicates that water is impaired because of a pollutant, and there's a specific process to go through to make that better. Criteria can either be numeric, so they're a number. That's often what we think of typically, like we're trying to attain a specific pH, or discharges need to have less than a certain amount of nitrogen in them in order to maintain water quality. But criteria can also be narrative. And so that means there's a descriptive text that says what the standard is that must be met in order to attain these designated uses. So next, we're going to go through some specific criteria in New Hampshire that are related to hydropower operations. This is not comprehensive of all of the criteria in New Hampshire, or all of the ones that can be related to or impacted by hydropower, but they are some of the major ones. And the first one is just the general criteria. And so this is the floor. This is the baseline at which all water in New Hampshire must meet, right? And so it must be free from substances which settle to form harmful deposits, float as foam, debris, scum, or other visible substances, produce odor, color, taste, or turbidity, which is not naturally occurring and which would not support the designated use, would result in the dominance of nuisance species or interfere with recreational activities. So this list here is just generally what the water quality must be. There are other criteria for specific parameters, such as temperature. And in New Hampshire, this is actually a narrative criteria. And so rather than trying to maintain a specific temperature, the New Hampshire criteria says that if you are discharging water, in this case, from the impoundment through the turbines or over the spillway into the river below the hydropower facility, that water can't be a temperature that is interfering with the natural function, right? And so it can't be warm enough to interfere with the designated uses. So you might ask, how does that relate to hydropower? Well, in many hydro facilities, we have this big impoundment, right? The impoundment is typically not moving as fast. We can get stratification, and so you can get a warm lens of water in the impoundment that then can be passed through depending upon where the water is being drawn from to power the turbines and cause a discharge of warmer water into the river below the facility. So this is one criteria that New Hampshire DES will be considering when they're looking at this, whether the hydropower operations are having an impact on temperature in the river or not. A second and related one is dissolved oxygen. So in New Hampshire, the criteria states that unless it's naturally occurring, all Class B waters need to have a greater than 75% dissolved oxygen as a daily average, or greater than 5 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen instantaneous reading. And these are the same for unstratified impoundments. The top portion of that unstratified impoundment needs to meet these criteria as well. And then there are different, more protective criteria for areas that we know cold water fish are spawning in. Because they need colder temperatures, they need higher dissolved oxygen in order for the eggs to develop, hatch, and then the fry to continue to live. So where we know cold water fish spawning habitat exists, there are more stringent criteria for dissolved oxygen within the Hampshire statute. Benthic deposits. This one is, I think, actually a really interesting criteria and one that not every state has, but New Hampshire does. And so the Connecticut River is a Class B water, right? So Class B waters shall contain no benthic deposits that have a detrimental impact on the benthic community unless naturally occurring. So you might ask, how does this relate to hydropower facilities? Well, again, when we are damming a river and we are restricting how the river flows naturally, one of the issues that occurs along with potential stratification and warming in the impoundment is you've interrupted the natural transport of sediment throughout the river, and you often get an sediment that is pooling upstream of the dam. And in our case, we've actually often seen in the Connecticut River, because of how the dam has been operated for many, many years, that are tributaries like the Saxons River and the Cold River that are coming in near the Bellows Falls Dam are dumping lots of sediment when they are coming and hitting the Connecticut River, because it's basically been hitting a wall rather than moving along downstream. And so this is water quality criteria that might come into play in terms of how sediment is being transported in relation to hydro operations on the Connecticut River as well. pH, so Class B waters need to be between 6.5 and 8.0 on the pH scale, unless due to natural causes. So what is a natural cause that might lower pH? Sometimes when you get a buildup of a lot of organic material, the decomposition of that material can naturally lower the pH. And we do actually have some areas of the Connecticut River that are affected by these dams that are impaired for pH. And so DES will be considering, as they do their analysis, whether that impairment is due to natural processes like the degradation of organic material that would be there without the dams there, or whether that lowering of pH is due in part to some operation of the dam. Turbidity. So again, in New Hampshire, Class B waters, unless it is naturally occurring, shall not have turbidity conditions that are exceeding the natural conditions by more than 10 NTU, which that's the unit for how we measure turbidity. So for those who are unfamiliar, turbidity is basically how much stuff is stirred up in the water, right? And so we see a really good example here from this picture of the Connecticut River entering Long Island Sound after Hurricane Irene. You can see the whole river here coming down and then going into Long Island Sound is brown. It is highly turbid. There is a lot of suspended sediment and other things in it. And look at it in comparison to the Thames River, just to the right of it, where there is not a lot of turbidity coming out into Long Island Sound. So that's a really dramatic example of it. But in general, we want to see the river not be highly turbid. If there's a lot of suspended sediment and high turbidity in the river, it causes problems for light penetration, for oxygen content, and a lot of other issues that affect the wildlife and the biology that are living in the river. And also, frankly, you look at a river that looks like that and you say, I don't want to go boating in that. And so that has an impact on other designated uses besides biology as well. Nutrients. Many people are familiar with the concept of eutrophication, where we get a lot of nutrients that enter a water body, and in fresh waters, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. In marine waters, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient. When a lot of them enter, you can get a large algal bloom. Those algae themselves sometimes are problematic. They can block light. There are some of them that produce toxins, but then also when the algal bloom dies and decomposes, it can also, in that decomposition process, suck up dissolved oxygen and lower the dissolved oxygen in the water. So when we are permitting processes in the river and in other waters, we want to ensure that there is not amounts of phosphorus or nitrogen that are going in that would impair existing or designated uses beyond what's naturally occurring. Biological and aquatic community integrity. This one makes a lot of sense, right? We just want waters in the state of New Hampshire that support and maintain a community that has species composition, diversity, and function comparable to what you would expect in a natural river system in that area. And that if there are differences due to whatever operation is occurring, those differences are not detrimental to community structure. So we've gone through designated uses and we've gone through criteria. And then the third part of the water quality standards is an anti-degradation policy. And that policy just says when you are permitting a process, that permit cannot lower the water quality from where it is. And so if you need to have protection for water quality for all existing uses, and that under the Clean Water Act, the anti-degradation policy must ensure the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation. And so that sounds really similar to the general criteria in New Hampshire, but there is also another anti-degradation policy. And part of that is saying is if we have attained a water quality that is higher than what's needed to meet the designated uses, we cannot lower that under the anti-degradation policy. We have to continue maintaining that high standard of water quality. And through the permitting process, except under very particular circumstances, we can't permit lowering that water quality. So if you want to see what some of this stuff looks like in New Hampshire, there is actually a web mapper on New Hampshire DES's website where they put up every other year their 303 and 305 lists. And so you can go in there, and you can click on a unit of water. In this case, I clicked on the reach of river that is upstream of the Bellows Falls Dam. So going up past Charlestown to Claremont, and it will come up and it will show you both what the water quality is and whether it is on the impaired list. So remember I said before, we actually have some stretches that are impaired for pH. This is one of them. And so you can see that it is in orange, so it is the poor, it's not supporting the designated uses for pH. But it is a low priority right now for establishing a TMDL and TMDL, total maximum daily load. And that can be for a number of reasons. One of them can be, we don't actually have enough information to understand why that pH is low. It is a low priority for a TMDL if it's not actually due to a pollutant. But this is a really nice resource where you can go in and you can click on it and you can see what the water quality in the areas you are interested in, and you can understand whether that water is impaired or not. And so the current state of the water is also something that New Hampshire DES will be considering when they are going through this certification process. I need a quick drink.
While you're drinking, I'll just point out on that previous slide how much missing data there is. Everything in gray actually indicates that there's no data. So an interesting consideration, right? When you're actually thinking about water quality is what we know exists or it doesn't.
Yeah.
Sweet. So, third
question. Go for it.
I wanted to add to it, that the, gray also could mean that there was not enough data to do a full assessment. Or to really learn the data we have.
So if you didn't hear that, the gray data can also mean that it's not just that there's no data, but that there might be data that exists, but not enough, or that it's so old that it is no longer relevant to current conditions. So moving on from New Hampshire water quality standards, we're going to talk about the Bellows Falls Dam a little bit more. Just to orient you, here we are looking at what's called the island in Bellows Falls. We have Bellows Falls, Vermont on the left-hand side. We have Walpole, New Hampshire on the right-hand side. The dam itself is up here. Can they see me pointing?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now you guys can. The powerhouse is down here, and there is a long stretch of the river which has been bypassed by the Power Canal. So this is referred to as the bypassed reach. It is the river, but it has been bypassed by diverting water to the powerhouse. At the powerhouse, there is a fish ladder here. This particular facility has 3 turbines currently. And in the proposal, there is a proposal to install a minimum flow turbine in the dam as well. And once that is done, it will have a 49.68 megawatt capacity at its maximum. And the maximum discharge is 11,740 CFS. So once there is more water than that coming down the river, it goes over the spillway into the bypass reach. And the Bellows Falls Dam has a about 26 mile impoundment. So you can see it up here, backing up all the way, not quite to Lebanon. It ends before that. All right, I'm going to walk you through the slide and I hope you can see it. One of the major things with this application is Great River Hydro has proposed an operational change for all 3 facilities, where it will be going from peaking operations to what we are referring to as inflow equals outflow as base operations. And so this graph is just comparing what things will look like between these 2 different situations. So on the bottom here, we have discharge. The red line is the current peaking operation. So you can see up, down, up, down, up, down with discharge. And these ones here, you can see the low level here is what's currently their minimum flow that they're required to pass. And they can go from the minimum flow straight up to 10,000 CFS or higher almost instantaneously. And what that looks like in terms of water surface elevation, which is up here at the top of the graph, the dark blue line is the current peaking operations. And again, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Right now, there is a very large range of water surface elevation at the dam that they're allowed to operate within. And that can translate to an even bigger up-down motion of the water surface further upstream in the impoundment. When they move to the proposed new operation, which I'm just gonna right now call inflow equals outflow, we'll go through some more details about that in the next slide. That's going to change dramatically. So they will be passing water through and generating power constantly. And so you can see this purple line here is the modeled discharge through the dam under the inflow equals outflow situation. And you're still seeing some up downs, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in general, that magnitude of up and down in both the discharge and up here, this light blue line is the water surface elevation, is dampened. So you've squished it, you've compressed it a little bit. The water surface elevation in particular, the goal is to maintain that at a much more stable level with some deviations. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about what those are a little bit more. So base operations are inflow equals outflow. That is the same for all three facilities owned by Great River Hydro. And they have a target water surface elevation at the dam of a 1 foot bandwidth during this inflow equals outflow operation. So most of the time, any water that is coming downstream is just getting passed through the turbines, and they are operating the turbines in a way to maintain that water surface elevation within that 1 foot bandwidth and hopefully right at that target. However, there are going to be what are called flex hours or flexible hours of operation. And these are hours in which Great River Hydro will be allowed to generate a little bit more. So it's not quite the same peaking operation, but it is similar to peaking. And so the number of hours per month that they will be allowed to do that vary based on what is happening ecologically in the river. So you can see April to June is the least number of hours, so 10 hours per month that they'll be allowed to do flex operations. And that's because that's sort of peak migratory fish and resident fish breeding season. And that differs fairly dramatically from the winter hours where they are allowed 65 hours per month of this flex operation. During the flex operation, they will be allowed at the dam to draw down 1.5 feet below that target elevation. But while they are drawing it down and ramping up generation, that has to be gradual. So they will no longer be able to go from a low flow to a high flow. They have to sort of taper up that increase of flow through the turbines in the up ramping. And that's in most cases. And then on the backside, when they're done with that time where they are generating a little bit of extra electricity during their flex hour time, that down ramping has to be gradual in all cases. And they've drawn down the impoundment a little bit during this extra generation flex hour. That impoundment has to be refilled back to the target surface elevation within 48 hours. And they can't just turn off the river like they do now and refill the impoundment. They have to maintain a minimum flow while they are refilling that impoundment. And that minimum flow is based on how much inflow is coming down the river to start with. So that's a little confusing when I just say it all out loud, but the hope is that when they're going to this inflow equals outflow as base operation, water is going to be moving constantly, water surface elevation will be more stable, and current will be consistent. And then there are contingency operations under emergency situations. These rules may not necessarily apply under all emergency conditions, and there's a whole separate section of the application about that. And so this operating procedure is what DES will be considering, the inflow equals outflow with the flex operations and all the considerations about how to constrain that. That's what they will be considering and thinking, how does that operation and what's happening within the river as a result of it impact water quality during this 401 certification process. So some more specifics about the Bellows Falls facility in this application. So again, inflow equals outflow proposal is the same. The water surface elevation target at the Bellows Falls Dam is 29.1 feet being sea level. which is slightly higher than what we often see the water at now. The other thing I mentioned before is that they have proposed to put a new minimum flow turbine in the dam at Bellows Falls. And that turbine will be passing a minimum flow of 300 CFS through the bypass reach at all times. That will be a requirement. There was a fish passage settlement agreement during this 12 years of negotiations and relicensing. And as per that agreement at the Bellows Falls Dam, there will be improved upstream passage for lamprey and eel. There will be longer opening times of the fish ladder from April 1st to July 15th in order to accommodate both the migratory fish and some resident species like white sucker that like to move around to breed as well. And there will be improved downstream passage specifically for eel, but will also benefit some other species as well. One thing that is not included in the fish passage settlement agreement that we would like to see happen is the removal of the salmon dam, which is in the bypass reach. Have that removed by Great River Hydro before these other alterations occur. And then because recreation is a designated use of pretty much all of our water, these are the recreation areas that they have proposed to continue to maintain and improve. But it is not just the recreation area, right? That means the water quality standard is being met. The water has to be suitable for recreation as well. But these are part of their proposal to maintain these areas for recreation as well. Okay, so what happens now? Now that you guys are all experts in New Hampshire water quality criteria and know a little bit about what's going to happen with the dams too. So we are here, we're in this public information session right now, which is a couple months into the 401 water quality certification process. We have heard from New Hampshire DES that they will be drafting a water quality certification and issuing that draft in the late winter. We all sort of have our fingers crossed that maybe that can be pushed earlier in the year, but right now this is when we are anticipating that draft water quality certification will be issued. And once that draft is issued, there will be a public hearing and a public comment period on the draft water quality certification. And then following that, the final water quality certification will be issued. That said, DES has said that they, at this point, are open to hearing comments from people about concerns that they have. And if you have more data or more information, that would be helpful for them when considering the drafting of this water quality certification. So that's sort of happening between now and next April. Simultaneously, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is drafting and will issue a draft environmental impact statement. That will occur in December of 2024. Following that, there will be a public meeting on the draft impact statement in January, and then the public can comment between January and February or whatever dates they issue at that time on the draft environmental impact statement. FERC will then go back and consider those comments and issue a final environmental impact statement by October of 2025. After all of that has happened, they have gotten the final water quality certifications from both New Hampshire and Vermont in the case of these facilities. They've issued their final environmental impact statement. They've considered the entirety of the application and thought it all through. They will issue a new license to the hydro facilities, possibly by late 2025 or early 2026. But as we have all seen through the process so far, sometimes things take a little bit longer than we think they're going to. We are anticipating that in that new license, there will be post-licensing requirements that Great River Hydro will need to complete. And those could include things like a recreation plan or shoreline management plan. And those may, in all likelihood, contain requirements for public engagement as well. So for those of you in the public, a lot of opportunities to continue to get your voices heard in this process. First, within the 401 water quality certification in New Hampshire, then on the environmental impact statement, and potentially in post-licensing requirements as well. That's all I have. We are very happy to take questions. This is my contact information, and then Daniel Demers is the Water Quality Certification Program Supervisor at New Hampshire DES, so he will actually be the one writing it. And then Judith Sears Houston is his supervisor, and she is here in the audience tonight too. So if we have questions for DES or clarifications about anything, these are appropriate people to contact. And then if you want to be notified about the draft water quality certification when it is issued, you can go to the water quality certification page on the New Hampshire DES website, and you have to click on a little arrow that says what ones are being considered right now, and you can click on the Bellas Falls Dam and ask to be notified when that draft water quality certification is issued. So there's a lot of talking. At this point, I am more than happy to entertain any questions that you might have online or in person. Kathy, I'll let you mediate over there.
Yeah, what's in the environmental impact statement? Are those like long-term expectations of environmental impact of operations or something else? What's in there?
That's a good question. Kathy, do you have a good answer for that? I haven't actually.
Yeah, and I'll just, for the folks online, our audience member asked what is actually included in the environmental impact statement. So, in this case, part of what's included and that is distinct in the environmental impact statement as opposed to like the other proceedings is that the federal government has to consider cumulative effect. So as we have been, as the companies have been doing studies and as we have been commenting, many of those comments and that focus has been kind of like project by project. Even the water quality certification, there's an application for each project separately. And so the environmental impact statement is going to be able to look at all 5 of the facilities together and consider when you add them all up, what does that mean? So, you know, as one example, you could think of fish migration, right? So for your one American shad who's trying to find their way up the river, if you're looking at each one of those projects separately, there seems like there's a lesser impact than the fact that that shad has to make its way through all 5 of them. So the idea is really to have a big picture view. It's also, the environmental impact statement comes out of a separate piece of federal legislation called the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires this type of like broader review to understand environmental impacts on federal actions. So, you know, each one of these sort of has its own legal trigger and it's kind of its own jurisdiction. So you think of FERC is really examining the licensing of energy facilities, right? And has certain requirements as to how they do that. The environmental impact statement is required out of this other piece of federal law. The 401 comes from the Clean Water Act, right? And then that gets promulgated through the states, right? So they can protect their own water quality. So. Anyone online have any questions or comments? You can just unmute or put your hand up or whatever.
Hi, can I ask that you go back to your next steps thing? Next steps, which is the one before it slide. I just wanted to clarify something.
I'm sorry, multitasking here. So Judith asked us to go back to the next step slide. There you go, to clarify something.
Where you have February/March 2025 public hearing and 30-day public comment period. We are not required to have a public hearing for the RSA 483 A12. I can rattle it off if I can remember it. And it's up to a 30-day public comment. So potentially it could be less than that, depending on where we are and the full track of things. So I do want to clarify that.
Yeah, so Judith was clarifying that the state is not required to hold a public hearing and that they can have a public comment period up to 30 days.
Anything else?
Other questions or comments online? Question from Kelly. Thank you for doing this. I'm listening too. Public comment can include what? So,
Oh,
the short answer is it can include any of the concerns you may have. So in some of the audiences for the Vermont public information sessions, the state staff in Vermont, any comments that have been already entered into the FERC docket, they said they will be considering. The FERC docket, given that we're going on year 13 of this, right? There's a lot of documentation in there. So, our recommendation is for people who have commented to FERC, those comments should likely be reiterated to the states, keeping in mind that the frame and the state's jurisdiction is different than what FERC's is. Which is why we're trying to kind of unpack the specifics of what's included in water quality standards in the different states so that folks can comment on things in a way that really kind of addresses water quality standards. And there's a different level because the water quality standards in the 3 states are different. There's also different interpretations as to sort of how a state would respond. And so one example of that is in Vermont, one of the designated uses is aesthetics. In New Hampshire, that's not a designated use. So even considering what the flow, a minimum flow that goes over the face of a dam, what it looks like from an aesthetic perspective is included in the water quality standards in Vermont. And so that could be something you could comment on. So that's sort of one example. Kate pointed out, you want to talk about the sediment?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, so I had pointed this out, the benthic deposits in New Hampshire, we have a water quality standard for that. And so if there are areas where there are unnatural buildups of sediments that are having a detrimental effect on water quality, either by blocking flow or potentially by causing lower pH, or in some cases, they can actually cause issues with nutrients as well. That's something to consider, and that can come into play in New Hampshire water quality certification, because we in New Hampshire have a standard for benthic deposits. And so you can comment on anything of concern to you, but I would emphasize that it needs to be related to a water quality standard in the state that you are commenting in. And so in New Hampshire, those standards are actually easily available to read. You can go to the same website on New Hampshire DES and download the most current PDF of what those water quality standards are and read them yourself so that you can understand what is being covered underneath these standards. If it's confusing, reach out to me, reach out to DES. We're happy to answer questions about that. Or I know I'm happy to answer questions about that. I don't speak for you.
Yeah, and including that recreation is a designated use in the water quality standards. So, you can think that water quality is really focused only on dissolved oxygen or some of the criteria that Kate went over, but it is actually a little more encompassing in terms of You know, it really is like what is included in the water quality standards of a state.
And if you remember from the general criteria in Hampshire, recreation was one of the general criteria, must look, and so under that standard, it has to look like you want to recreate in it. And so that's actually pretty powerful, right? If you are someone that uses the river constantly and can point out and have data showing that it doesn't support this designated use of recreation simply because it looks gross, that's something that the state needs to know about.
So Kelly commented, okay, so ideas for ways they can support or enhance recreation, concerns about the impacts of the dams on shoreline erosion, habitat, sediment building up at the mouths of tributaries, impacting water quality and or recreational access, etc. How formal do project ideas need to be at this point? And I presume they must be within the impoundment area, even if up a tributary, so long as it was within the impoundment area. So one of the, maybe I can go back to it. One of the images here, each project has a specific project area. It's a little hard to see in the map there, Kelly, on the right, but there's like a boundary line. And so there's actually specific exhibits that show the exact project area. And in general, the project area does go up the mouths of the tributaries, and it includes the riverbank. So it's not just the impoundment, it also includes a certain length of the river below the dam, including like the tail race and, you know, the spill area. How formal do project ideas need to be at this point? So this is something that came up in one of our conversations in Vermont, given that Great River Hydro really does not have a recreation plan. They included a couple random things that they committed to do in their application that they filed in December of 2020. And then in response to an additional information request from FERC, they provided these Excel spreadsheets with very little explanation that indicated there may be some other recreational things they might do. That happened in March of 2021. So what's one of the things we're pondering or we're struggling with is whether or not the water quality certification should be denied because they actually have not provided the information they need to evaluate. So for instance, like how can the state ensure that recreational access to support a designated use is supported if we don't actually know what the recreation plan entails in terms of the details? So yeah, it's a little complicated. So in terms of how formal project ideas need to be, they should be specifically fleshed out so that they can be analyzed to identify if it's meeting water quality standards.
And you're talking about Great River Hydro as a project, that project idea, right? Like,
no, I think maybe Kelly can clarify, but I thought she meant like the ideas that Great River Hydro has as projects that, yeah.
yes, but it's related to the project. It's not like Kelly's coming up with a project to fix. And that project, she's relating that project to.
That's actually where my head was at, was coming up with a project that Great River Hydro might consider as part of the recreation enhancement plan. And that's what I was wondering, how formal would that kind of idea need to be at this point for public comment?
Well, one thing to keep in mind that these comments on the 401 water quality certification are going to the state, right? And it's, while Great River Hydro will certainly see them, it's not sort of the same conversation that you have with them like you have had when commenting through the FERC process. And that's a hard question to answer. Yeah. I,
All right,
I-
I can actually contact you separately about that if that's easier.
Well, I think what's important for this process, Kelly, is that you are pointing out where there's a problem, right? And
Okay,
where there's an issue where water quality standards are not being met and designated uses are not being supported. And I don't necessarily think that you have to solve that problem by yourself at this time. But it is really important to point out that there is an issue. And yeah, maybe happy to brainstorm about that with you more. When I can see you.
Yeah, we can talk about it separately offline, but you think about the amount of sediment load at the mouth of the Black River and Hoyt's Landing. That's a problem.
yeah,
And the
that's,
problem exists because of how they operate the hydro facility.
Yeah.
So that fits squarely in consideration of this
Perfect.
water quality certification.
okay, and I'd be happy to go off into the, well, pardon the pun, off into the weeds in an email with you guys. Thank you. Dinner's ready, so I gotta hop off, but I wanted to toss that out there. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
All right, if there's no further questions or comments, I just want to say thank you all very much for attending. We really appreciate people coming to learn more and strongly encourage you all to engage in this process as it continues to move forward.
Thank you guys so much for doing this.
Yeah. Our pleasure.
Have a good night.
Okay, you
Thank
too.
you.